The whispers followed her like shadows as Eleanor Fairfield hurried down the main street of Julesburg, Colorado, in the spring of 1876. Her once fine dress was worn at the edges, her blonde hair hastily pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and the weight of what everyone thought they knew about her hung heavier than the Bible clutched in her trembling hands. Church bells rang out across the small frontier town, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Families in their Sunday best strolled toward the white clapboard building with its modest steeple reaching toward the clear blue sky. Eleanor paused at the foot of the church steps, her heart pounding in her chest. The murmurs grew louder as townsfolk noticed her standing there, frozen in place. The nerve of that woman, after what she's done. No place for her kind in God's house. Eleanor took a step back, shame burning her cheeks. She had known this would happen, yet something had compelled her to try. 3 months had passed since the scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Julesburg, and the ache of isolation had become unbearable. Perhaps she had hoped for Christian forgiveness, but the hard stares of the church-going folk told her she had miscalculated badly. As she turned to leave, a warm, calloused hand caught hers. "Miss, I believe you dropped this." Eleanor looked up into eyes the color of a summer sky. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind. He wore clean but simple clothes, a pressed shirt and vest with a cowboy hat in his free hand. In the other, he held out her handkerchief, which she hadn't even realized she'd dropped. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, accepting it with trembling fingers. Vaughn Thornton, he introduced himself with a slight tip of his head, new to these parts. "Eleanor Fairfield," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her name. Everyone in Julesburg knew what that name meant now. To her surprise, Vaughn showed no sign of recognition or disgust. Instead, he glanced at the church and then back to her hesitating form. "Mighty fine day for service," he said conversationally. "Would you mind if I accompanied you inside?" Eleanor shook her head slightly. "Sir, you don't understand. I can't." "Can't what, Miss Fairfield?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Enter," she whispered, looking down at her worn boots. "Not anymore." Vaughn studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Without another word, he offered his arm to her. "Everyone deserves to hear the Lord's word, Miss Fairfield. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to walk you in." Eleanor stared at his offered arm, then at his face. There was no judgment there, no hidden agenda she could detect, just a kindness she hadn't experienced in months. "The things they say about me," she began. "I don't much care for gossip," Vaughn interrupted. "Never did find it useful." A small, fragile hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "You'll regret it, Mr. Thornton. Your reputation is mine to worry about," he finished for her. His smile was as warm as the spring sunshine. "What do you say, Miss Fairfield? Shall we?" After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. The whispers intensified as Vaughn led her up the steps, but he kept his head high, his stride confident. As they approached the entrance, Pastor Miller himself blocked the doorway, his expression stern. "Miss Fairfield," the pastor said coldly, "I think it best if you—" "Good morning, Pastor," Vaughn cut in smoothly. "Beautiful day the Lord has made, isn't it? I'm Vaughn Thornton, just arrived in town. Miss Fairfield has kindly agreed to introduce me to your congregation." The pastor's mouth opened and closed, caught between Christian duty to welcome newcomers and his desire to turn away the fallen woman on Vaughn's arm. "Mr. Thornton, perhaps you're unaware that the good book speaks of forgiveness and not casting stones." Vaughn's tone remained pleasant, but steel underlay his words. "I'm well aware of that passage, Pastor." A tense silence followed. Eleanor's heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Finally, with obvious reluctance, the pastor stepped aside. "Welcome to our church, Mr. Thornton," he said stiffly. "Thank you kindly," Vaughn replied, guiding Eleanor past the threshold. The congregation's stares burned into them as they walked down the aisle. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, even as she heard the whispers and felt the judgment. Vaughn led her to a pew near the middle of the church and let her slide in first before taking a seat beside her. As Pastor Miller began the service, Eleanor whispered, "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Vaughn kept his eyes forward, but his voice was soft when he replied, "My ma always said true character shows in how a person treats those others have cast aside." "You don't know what I've done." "No," he agreed, "but I know what it's like to need a second chance." As the hymns began, Eleanor found her voice joining with the congregation's, timid at first, then growing stronger. For the first time in months, something like peace settled over her. She didn't know who this cowboy was or why he'd chosen to help her, but in that moment, his kindness was a lifeline she clung to with desperate gratitude. She couldn't have known then how that simple act of taking her hand would change both their lives forever. The sermon that morning focused ironically on redemption, and Eleanor felt the weight of every word as if it were directed specifically at her. Several times, she caught herself on the verge of tears, and each time, Vaughn would subtly shift beside her, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. After the service ended, Eleanor braced herself for the inevitable confrontations. People filed past, some pointedly ignoring her presence while others whispered behind gloved hands. Vaughn stayed steadfastly at her side, his posture relaxed but watchful. Mrs. Abigail Crawford, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Julesburg, approached with two of her friends in tow. "Mr. Thornton, is it?" she asked, pointedly addressing only him. "I feel I should warn you about the company you're keeping. We pride ourselves on being a God-fearing community with certain standards." Eleanor stared at the floor, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "Madam," Vaughn replied politely, "I appreciate your concern. Where I come from, we believe in letting the Lord handle the judging, while we humans focus on the loving our neighbor's part." Mrs. Crawford's lips thinned. "Some neighbors make that quite difficult, Mr. Thornton." "I've always found difficult tasks the most rewarding," he countered, his smile unwavering. The woman huffed and moved along, but not before giving Eleanor a withering glare. Once they were relatively alone again, Eleanor released a shaky breath. "You shouldn't have done that." "Now they'll talk about you too." "Let them," Vaughn said with a shrug. "Words only have the power we give them." As they made their way out of the church, Pastor Miller intercepted them at the door. "Miss Fairfield," he said stiffly, "while our doors are open to all sinners seeking redemption, I would hope you understand the discomfort your presence causes in our congregation." Before Eleanor could respond, Vaughn spoke. "Forgive me, Pastor, but isn't discomfort sometimes necessary for growth? The Lord worked with tax collectors and prostitutes. Surely Julesburg's faithful can withstand a bit of discomfort in his service." The pastor's face flushed. "Mr. Thornton, you're new here. You don't understand the situation." "Perhaps not," Vaughn conceded, "but I understand Christian charity well enough." With a gentle pressure on her elbow, Vaughn guided Eleanor past the flustered pastor and down the church steps. The spring air felt fresher somehow, as if a storm had passed. "Mr. Thornton," Eleanor said once they'd reached the street, "I'm grateful for your kindness, but I should warn you association with me will do you no favors in Julesburg." "Call me Vaughn," he replied, "and I don't much care for favors earned by abandoning those in need." She studied him more carefully in the clear light of day. He was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting a man who smiled often. His sandy brown hair was neatly trimmed, and though his clothes were simple, they were clean and well kept. "What brings you to Julesburg, Mr. Vaughn?" she asked. "Work," he answered. "I've signed on with the Sherman Ranch outside town, cattle operation, owners looking to expand his herd this season." "Old Mr. Sherman, he's a fair employer," Eleanor noted, surprised. "My father used to do business with him." "Your father?" Eleanor tensed, realizing she'd inadvertently opened a door to her past. "He owned the mercantile before he passed last year." "I'm sorry for your loss," Vaughn said sincerely. They walked in silence for a moment, the bustle of Julesburg's Sunday crowds around them. People still stared and whispered, but with Vaughn beside her, Eleanor found it easier to ignore. "Would you allow me to see you home?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. "It's not far, just past the edge of town." "All the more reason to offer my company," he said. "It's the proper thing to do." A small smile touched her lips at his old-fashioned courtesy. "Very well." As they walked, Eleanor felt a strange lightness in her chest. For months, she had avoided the town as much as possible, making only necessary trips for supplies. To walk openly down Main Street, even with the whispers, felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. "How long have you been in Julesburg?" Vaughn asked as they left the more populated streets behind. "All my life," she replied. "Though lately it feels like a different place entirely." "Towns are just collections of people," Vaughn observed, "and people can change their minds given time and reason." Eleanor glanced at him. "You're an optimist, Mr. Thornton." "Vaughn," he reminded her with a smile, "and I prefer to think of myself as stubborn rather than optimistic." They reached a modest house set back from the road, with a small garden that showed signs of careful tending despite the lack of ornamental touches. A far cry from the large home behind the mercantile where Eleanor had grown up, but it was hers the only thing her father's debts hadn't claimed. "This is me," she said, stopping at the gate. Vaughn took in the property with an appreciative eye. "Nice place, peaceful." "It serves its purpose," she said, suddenly self-conscious about the peeling paint and sagging porch step. "Thank you for your company, Miss Fairfield," Vaughn said, removing his hat. "I hope I might call on you again sometime." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "You can't be serious." "I rarely joke about such matters," he replied, his expression earnest. "You don't know me," she said softly. "You don't know what happened." "I know enough to make my own judgments," Vaughn countered. "But if you prefer I didn't call, I'll respect your wishes." Eleanor studied him, searching for any sign of mockery or hidden intent, but found none, only a straightforward kindness that had become foreign to her. "Sunday next," she said finally. "If you still wish to attend church, I would appreciate your company." Vaughn's smile brightened his entire face. "I'll call for you at 10 then." As she watched him walk away, hat settled back on his head and a slight spring in his step, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the faintest stirring of hope. The week passed with excruciating slowness for Eleanor. Each day, she tended to her small vegetable garden, made and mended clothing for the few families that still employed her skills, and tried not to think about Sunday. Tried not to hope that Vaughn Thornton would keep his word. Men had made promises to her before. One in particular had made promises he'd had no intention of keeping. On Thursday afternoon, as she was hanging laundry to dry, a wagon approached her house. Eleanor tensed, preparing for another delivery of stones or dead animals on her porch. It wouldn't be the first time the town's more vindictive residents had expressed their disapproval. Instead, the wagon stopped at her gate, and a familiar figure jumped down. "Afternoon, Miss Fairfield," Vaughn called, removing his hat. Eleanor clutched a damp sheet to her chest. "Mr. Thornton, what brings you here?" "I was heading to town for supplies," he explained, approaching the fence. "Thought I might ask if you needed anything while I'm there." The simple kindness of the offer caught her off guard. "That's very thoughtful, but I couldn't impose." "No imposition at all," he insisted. "I'm making the trip anyway." Eleanor hesitated. She did need flour and salt, but her monthly trip to the mercantile wasn't scheduled until next week, a dreaded experience she carefully timed to avoid the busiest hours. "If you're certain it's no trouble," she said finally, "I could use a few things." "Happy to help," Vaughn said with a warm smile. "Make me a list." Eleanor nodded and hurried inside, her heart beating faster than it should for such a mundane interaction. She scribbled a short list and counted out the coins from her dwindling savings, then returned to find Vaughn examining her garden. "You've got a good crop coming along," he observed. "Those tomato plants look especially promising." "My mother taught me," Eleanor said, handing him the list and money. "She always said growing your own food was the surest way to independence." "Wise woman," Vaughn replied, tucking the list into his pocket but hesitating over the money. "I can spot you until payday if—" "No," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "I pay my own way, Mr. Thornton." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, accepting the coins. "As you wish, Miss Fairfield, I respect that." After he left, Eleanor found herself smiling as she returned to her laundry. It was such a small thing, an offer of a simple errand, yet it felt monumental after months of isolation. 2 hours later, Vaughn returned. As he unloaded her supplies, Eleanor noticed he'd included a small packet of peppermint candies that hadn't been on her list. "I didn't ask for these," she said, holding up the paper-wrapped sweets. "Consider them a gift," Vaughn said easily. "The mercantile owner threw them in when I mentioned they were for you." Eleanor's expression must have shown her disbelief because Vaughn quickly added, "Not Mr. Peterson. He's away on business, apparently. His nephew's running things, young fellow named Oliver." "Ollie," Eleanor said softly. "He was a friend of my father's, seemed like a decent sort," Vaughn agreed. "Asked me to tell you he hopes you're well." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Such a small kindness shouldn't affect her so deeply, but it did. "Thank you," she said, composing herself. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer for your trouble." Vaughn glanced at the sky, judging the time. "I'd be obliged if it's not an imposition." Eleanor led him to the small porch and indicated he should sit while she prepared the coffee. When she returned with 2 steaming cups, she found him repairing the loose step she'd been meaning to fix for months. "Mr. Thornton, you don't need to do that," she protested. "Nearly done," he replied, hammering a final nail into place. "Just needed a few reinforcements." He tested the step with his weight, nodding with satisfaction when it held firm. "You're very handy," Eleanor observed, handing him a cup. "Necessary skill out here," he said, settling onto the porch chair. "Ranch work teaches a man to fix just about anything." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across Eleanor's modest property. In the distance, the mountains were purple silhouettes against the golden sky. "May I ask you something, Miss Fairfield?" Eleanor tensed slightly. Here it comes, she thought, the questions about her past, her shame. "You may ask," she replied cautiously. "How long have you lived in this house?" "It has good bones, but I noticed the roof might need attention before winter comes." Relief flooded through her. "Just since last winter. After my father died and the mercantile was sold to pay his debts, this was all that remained. It belonged to my mother's family." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "The west slope of the roof has a few loose shingles. I could help you repair them before the rainy season if you'd allow it." "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question burst from Eleanor before she could stop it. Vaughn considered her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I told you before where I come from. We help neighbors in need." "We're not neighbors, Mr. Thornton. We're barely acquaintances." "Then perhaps we should remedy that," he said simply. "I find I'd like to know you better, Miss Fairfield." Eleanor stared at him, searching for any sign of deception. "You must have heard things about me in town by now." "Some," he admitted, "though I make it a rule to form my own opinions about people." "And if the things you've heard are true," Vaughn set his empty cup aside. "I've known good people who have made bad choices, Miss Fairfield, and I've known seemingly upright folks who harbor the blackest hearts. The measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, but in how they face them." His words struck her like a physical blow. For months, Eleanor had carried her shame like a stone around her neck, never considering that redemption might be possible. "Sunday," she said softly. "If you still wish to escort me to church, perhaps afterwards we might talk properly." Vaughn smiled, the expression warming his eyes. "I'd like that very much, Miss Fairfield." As he rode away, Eleanor found herself wondering if perhaps the worst mistake she could make now would be turning away the unexpected kindness that had walked into her life. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that spoke of spring's tenuous hold in the Colorado highlands. Eleanor rose before dawn, heating water for a proper bath, a luxury she rarely indulged in anymore. She washed her hair and pinned it carefully, then donned her best dress, a navy blue cotton that had once belonged to her mother. As she prepared, Eleanor tried to quell the nervous flutter in her stomach. In the 3 days since Vaughn's visit, she had vacillated between hope and dread. What if he didn't come? Worse, what if he did come, but she told him everything and watched the now familiar disgust cloud his kind eyes. At precisely 10 o'clock, she heard the creak of wagon wheels outside. Taking a deep breath, she opened her door to find Vaughn approaching, dressed in his Sunday best, a clean, dark suit that, while not fancy, was well tailored to his broad shoulders. "Good morning, Miss Fairfield," he greeted her, removing his hat. You look lovely. Eleanor felt a blush warm her cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. You're very punctual. My father believed tardiness was a form of dishonesty, promising to be somewhere at a certain time and then breaking that promise, he explained, offering his arm. Made quite an impression on me as a boy. She accepted his arm, allowing him to help her into the wagon. As they set off toward town, Eleanor found herself unusually tongue-tied. She'd rehearsed what she might say to him after church, how she would explain the scandal that had made her an outcast, but now words failed her. Beautiful day, Vaughn commented, seemingly comfortable with her silence. Reminds me of Wyoming Springs, though perhaps a touch warmer here. Is that where you're from, Wyoming? Eleanor asked, grateful for the safe topic. Born there, he confirmed. Worked ranches all over the Montana, Dakota territory, even spent some time in Texas, though the heat nearly did me in. What brought you to Colorado? She asked. Heard the Sherman outfit needed experienced hands and I was looking for somewhere to settle more permanently. He glanced at her. Getting a bit old for drifting from job to job. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? 32 next month, he replied. Ancient by cowboy standards. Most fellows my age have either moved up to foreman, found a different trade, or he trailed off, or she prompted. Or died, he finished simply. It's not the safest profession. The honesty in his answer touched her. I'm 26, she offered. Ancient by spinster standards, according to Mrs. Crawford. Vaughn chuckled. Mrs. Crawford seems to have strong opinions about many things. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, Eleanor said with a small smile. They reached the outskirts of Julesburg, and Eleanor felt the familiar tension creep into her shoulders. Vaughn must have noticed because he said quietly, Remember, you have as much right to worship as anyone in that church. His certainty steadied her, and when they pulled up in front of the white clapboard building, Eleanor held her head a fraction higher than she had the previous week. The whispers still followed them as Vaughn helped her down from the wagon and escorted her up the steps, but they seemed less venomous somehow. Perhaps it was simply that Eleanor had expected them this time, or perhaps the novelty of her appearance had worn off slightly. Pastor Miller greeted them with a stiff nod, his disapproval evident but tempered by Vaughn's presence. They took seats in the same pew as before, and as the service began, Eleanor was surprised to find herself able to focus on the sermon rather than the stares at her back. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to disperse, a young woman approached them tentatively. Eleanor recognized her as Sarah Wilson, the schoolteacher who had arrived in Julesburg only months before the scandal broke. Miss Fairfield, she said softly, I just wanted to say it's nice to see you again. The children ask about you sometimes. Before her disgrace, Eleanor had occasionally helped at the schoolhouse, teaching the girls sewing skills while their brothers learned woodworking from Mr. Peterson. Thank you, Miss Wilson, Eleanor replied, touched by the simple kindness. Please tell them I'm well. Sarah nodded, smiled briefly at Vaughn, and moved away before any of the town's matrons could notice their interaction. See, Vaughn murmured as they made their way outside. Not everyone shares Mrs. Crawford's opinions. Miss Wilson is new enough that my reputation doesn't affect her standing, Eleanor explained. For the others, association with me is more complicated. They walked to the wagon in silence, both aware of the curious eyes following them. As Vaughn helped her up, he asked, Would you still like to talk, Miss Fairfield? We could have a picnic by the creek if you're amenable. I took the liberty of packing some food. Eleanor hesitated only briefly. Yes, I think it's time you knew the truth. They rode out of town, following the winding creek that fed the farms and ranches around Julesburg. Vaughn found a peaceful spot beneath a stand of cottonwoods, where the water bubbled over smooth stones and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. After spreading a blanket and setting out a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit, Vaughn settled beside Eleanor, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I'm listening, he said simply, whenever you're ready. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. My father owned the mercantile in Julesburg for nearly 30 years. After my mother died of influenza when I was 16, it was just the two of us. I helped in the store, kept our home, and eventually took over most of the bookkeeping." She paused, plucking a blade of grass and twisting it between her fingers. What I didn't know, what no one knew, was that my father had developed a gambling problem. He kept it well hidden, traveling to Denver occasionally for business. Last year, he fell ill suddenly. Pneumonia. Before he died, he confessed everything to me. The mercantile was deeply in debt, mortgaged to cover his losses. Vaughn listened silently, his expression compassionate but neutral. After the funeral, a man named James Blackwell arrived from Denver. He held most of my father's debt notes and informed me that unless they were paid in full, he would take the store and our home. Eleanor's voice hardened. He offered me another option. He said he was taken with me and proposed marriage. In exchange, he would forgive my father's debts. "This Blackwell?" Vaughn asked quietly. "How old was he?" 53, Eleanor replied. "And already married," though he neglected to mention that part. Understanding dawned in Vaughn's eyes. "I see." "I refused him, of course," Eleanor continued. "But he was persistent, visiting frequently, bringing gifts, making promises about how well he would provide for me. I was desperate to save my father's legacy, but not that desperate." She took a sip of water from the canteen Vaughn offered, steeling herself for the most difficult part. "One evening, he came to the store just as I was closing. He'd been drinking and became forceful in his attentions. I fought him off, but in the struggle, an oil lamp was knocked over. The fire spread quickly." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering the terror of that night. "I managed to get out, but the mercantile burned to the ground. Blackwell escaped too, but not before suffering burns to his face and hands." "And he blamed you," Vaughn surmised. Eleanor nodded. "He told everyone I had tried to seduce him, and when he rejected me, I attempted to kill him in a jealous rage." His standing in Denver business circles made his word unquestionable. "The fact that he was married only added to my shame in the town's eyes. They believed I had knowingly pursued a married man." "What about the law?" Vaughn asked, a hardness entering his voice. "Surely the Sheriff Davies, investigated, but it was my word against Blackwell's." With no witnesses and Blackwell's influential connections, the matter was eventually dropped as inconclusive, but the damage to my reputation was done. She met Vaughn's gaze directly. "The store and our home were sold to pay my father's debts. I was left with nothing but this small property my mother had inherited. Most of the town believes I'm a fallen woman who tried to murder her married lover." Silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle gurgling of the creek and the distant call of a meadowlark. Eleanor waited for Vaughn's reaction, preparing herself for disappointment or, worse, disbelief. Instead, he asked quietly, "What happened to Blackwell?" "He returned to Denver," she replied. "I heard he told people there he was injured saving orphans from a fire." A bitter laugh escaped her. "He's probably been made a deacon in his church by now." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "Men like that rarely face earthly consequences for their actions." "No," Eleanor agreed softly, "they don't." "I believe you," Vaughn said simply, 3 words. Just 3 words, but they washed over Eleanor like a spring rain, cleansing and life-giving. For months, no one had believed her side of the story, had even given her the chance to tell it. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back tears. "No need for thanks, Miss Fairfield." "Truth has a certain ring to it." Vaughn picked up a stone and skipped it across the creek's surface. "I had a sister once, Emily. Something similar happened to her back in Cheyenne." Eleanor's heart constricted. "What became of her?" She couldn't bear the shame others put on her. "Took her own life." His voice was steady, but pain shadowed his eyes. "I've never understood why victims carry the burden of shame that rightfully belongs to their attackers." "I'm so sorry about your sister," Eleanor said softly. Vaughn nodded his acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago, but it's why I can't abide seeing someone ostracized for something that wasn't their fault." He turned to face her fully. "Miss Fairfield, Eleanor, if I may, what happened to you was wrong, both Blackwell's actions and the town's response." The use of her given name startled her, but she found she didn't mind. "It's kind of you to say so, Vaughn, but nothing will change Julesburg's mind about me now. People can surprise you," he said. "Not all at once and not all of them, but enough to make a difference." They finished their meal in companionable silence, the weight of Eleanor's confession hanging between them not as a barrier, but as a new understanding. As they packed up the remains of their picnic, Vaughn hesitated. "I'd like to call on you properly, Eleanor, with your permission." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "Even after everything I've told you, especially after everything you've told you," he replied firmly. "You've shown remarkable strength and dignity in the face of injustice. I'd consider it an honor to know you better." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a genuine smile spread across her face. "I think I'd like that very much, Vaughn." As spring blossomed into summer, Vaughn became a regular visitor at Eleanor's modest home. True to his word, he helped repair her roof, reinforced her porch, and even built a small chicken coop when she mentioned wanting to keep hens. Their courtship progressed slowly, deliberately. Vaughn was unfailingly respectful, always conscious of Eleanor's reputation and careful not to give the town any further reason to gossip. They attended church together each Sunday, and gradually, some of the open hostility toward Eleanor began to fade, not disappear entirely, but diminish in the face of Vaughn's steady presence at her side. By mid-July, Eleanor found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She had not expected to find joy again, certainly not in the form of a kind-eyed cowboy who had simply taken her hand when she needed it most. On a particularly warm evening, they sat on her newly repaired porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Eleanor had made lemonade, and Vaughn had brought a small packet of cookies from the bakery in town. "Miss Wilson stopped me after church on Sunday," Eleanor mentioned, sipping her drink. "She's asked if I might consider helping at the school again this fall, just one afternoon a week, teaching the girls to sew." Vaughn smiled broadly. "That's wonderful, Eleanor. What did you tell her?" "I said I'd think about it," she admitted. "Part of me wants to say yes immediately, but—" "You're afraid of the reception you'll receive," he finished for her. She nodded. "The children are innocent in all this, but their parents. Their parents will have to decide what's more important, their children's education or their own prejudices." Vaughn reached over and gently took her hand. "But whatever you decide, I'll support you." The simple touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's body. These small gestures, a hand on her elbow, fingers brushing as they walked, his palm steady against her back, had become precious to her over the past months. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Vaughn's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Eleanor, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened. "Yes. The Sherman Ranch is having their summer social next weekend. All the hands in there, well, their families and special friends are invited." He looked somewhat bashful suddenly. "I was hoping you might accompany me." Eleanor blinked in surprise. This was different from their church attendance or quiet walks together. This was a public declaration of sorts, attending a social gathering as his chosen companion. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly. "Some of the ranchers' wives might not. Mrs. Sherman specifically asked me to extend the invitation to you," Vaughn interrupted gently. "She said, and I quote, that poor girl has been punished enough for something that wasn't her fault. It's high time someone showed some Christian charity." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. "She said that?" Vaughn nodded. "Mrs. Sherman is a formidable woman with significant influence. If she's decided you're to be welcomed, others will follow her lead." "Then yes," Eleanor said, her voice stronger. "I would be honored to accompany you." Vaughn's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll pick you up at 4 on Saturday then. There'll be dancing after the supper if you're amenable." "I haven't danced in years," Eleanor admitted. "Neither have I," Vaughn replied with a chuckle. "We can stumble through it together." As he prepared to leave that evening, Vaughn hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps. In the soft glow of the lantern hanging by her door, his expression was serious, thoughtful. "Eleanor," he said, her name almost a caress on his lips. "I want you to know that I've come to care for you deeply these past months." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "I've come to care for you too, Vaughn." He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, equally stationary. They stood there, separated by just a few feet and a world of unspoken feelings. Then, with deliberate slowness, Vaughn moved up one step, then another, until he stood just below her on the porch. "May I?" he asked softly. Eleanor nodded, unable to form words as he leaned forward, one hand gently cupping her cheek as his lips met hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. It was brief, chaste even, but when he pulled away, Eleanor felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. "Good night, Eleanor," Vaughn whispered. "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, her voice barely audible. As she watched him ride away into the darkness, Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since the night of the fire, she allowed herself to believe that happiness might not be forever beyond her reach. The Sherman Ranch Social was the largest gathering Eleanor had attended since her father's funeral. As Vaughn drove their wagon onto the sprawling property, she clutched her handkerchief nervously, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her best dress, a pale blue cotton with delicate embroidery she had added herself. "You look beautiful," Vaughn assured her, sensing her anxiety. He himself cut a handsome figure in a new vest and crisp white shirt, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. "There are so many people," Eleanor observed, watching families and couples mill about the decorated barnyard. Lanterns hung from posts, trestle tables groaned with food, and a small group of musicians was setting up near a cleared area that would serve as a dance floor. "Just remember, Mrs. Sherman invited you personally," Vaughn reminded her. "That carries weight." As if summoned by her name, Martha Sherman appeared as they climbed down from the wagon. She was a stout, practical woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing about her ranch or the people on it. "Mr. Thornton," she greeted Vaughn warmly, then turned to Eleanor. "And Miss Fairfield, I'm so pleased you could join us." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Sherman," Eleanor replied, bracing herself for the polite but distant treatment she had become accustomed to. Instead, Mrs. Sherman took her arm companionably. "Come, let me introduce you to some of the other ladies. My husband speaks highly of Mr. Thornton's work, says he's the best horseman we've had in years. We're all quite curious about the woman who's caught his eye." With a reassuring nod from Vaughn, Eleanor allowed herself to be led away. To her surprise, Mrs. Sherman's introduction set the tone for the evening. While a few of the women were initially reserved, most followed their hostess's lead in welcoming Eleanor. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself relaxing, even enjoying conversations about garden troubles and recipe exchanges, normal, everyday topics that had been absent from her life for too long. Vaughn checked on her periodically but gave her space to reacquaint herself with social interactions. After the communal supper, as dusk settled over the ranch, the musicians struck up a lively tune. Couples began moving toward the dance floor, and Vaughn appeared at Eleanor's side. "May I have this dance, Miss Fairfield?" he asked formally, a twinkle in his eye. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Thornton," she replied, placing her hand in his. True to their predictions, they were both somewhat rusty, but Vaughn's natural grace and Eleanor's light step soon had them moving comfortably to the music. As he guided her through a turn, his hand warm and steady at her waist, Eleanor caught Mrs. Crawford watching from the sidelines, her expression sour. "Don't mind her," Vaughn murmured, following Eleanor's gaze. "She's just upset that her opinion isn't as influential as Mrs. Sherman's." "I've spent so long caring what people like her think," Eleanor admitted. "It's strange to realize their power only exists if I grant it to them." Vaughn's eyes softened. "That's a hard-won wisdom many never achieve." As the evening deepened and the music slowed, Vaughn held her closer, their movements less a formal dance and more a gentle swaying together. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, inhaling the clean scent of soap and sun-warmed cotton that had become so familiar to her. "Eleanor," Vaughn said softly, his breath warm against her hair, "there's something I need to tell you." She tilted her head back to look at him, seeing something serious in his expression. "What is it?" "Not here," he said, glancing around at the other couples. "Can we walk for a moment?" Nodding, Eleanor allowed him to lead her away from the dancing, past the barn to a quieter area where the sounds of the social were muffled. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "No," Vaughn assured her quickly. "Nothing's wrong. In fact," he took both her hands in his, "everything feels more right than it has in a very long time." Relief flooded through her, followed by curiosity. "What did you want to tell me then?" Vaughn took a deep breath. "Mr. Sherman has offered me a permanent position as his foreman. His current man is retiring come fall, and he wants me to take over." "Vaughn, that's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "It's a significant promotion. You must be so pleased." "I am," he agreed, "but there's more to it. The position comes with the use of a house on the property, a real house, not the bunkhouse, 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, even a small parlor." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "That sounds lovely." "It is," Vaughn said, his voice dropping lower. "But it would be empty without the right person to share it with." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing something small that glinted in the starlight. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized what it was: a simple gold ring with a modest pearl set in the center. "Eleanor Fairfield," Vaughn said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "these past months have been the happiest of my life. You are the strongest, most gracious woman I've ever known, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Vaughn, are you certain? My reputation is of no concern to me," he interrupted gently. "I love you, Eleanor, not despite what you've endured, but including it. Every experience, good and bad, has shaped you into the woman I want to spend my life with." "I love you too," she whispered, the words she had held back for weeks finally finding voice. "Yes, Vaughn, yes, I'll marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Perhaps it had been. "It was my mother's," he explained, noticing her admiring the pearl. "She made me promise to give it only to a woman of true character. I'll try to be worthy of it," Eleanor said softly. "You already are," Vaughn assured her, drawing her into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, filled with promise and shared joy. Eleanor melted into it, her arms sliding around his neck as she allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had found. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "Mrs. Sherman will be insufferably pleased with herself," he chuckled. "She's been hinting for weeks that I should make an honest woman of you, as she puts it." "Is that why she invited me tonight?" "As matchmaking?" "Partially," Vaughn admitted. "But also because she genuinely believes you've been wronged by the town's judgment. She lost a sister in similar circumstances many years ago and has never forgotten it." Eleanor's heart warmed at this unexpected connection. "When shall we be married?" "As soon as you're ready," Vaughn replied, "though I'd suggest before I take over as foreman in September so we can move into the house together." "A month, then," Eleanor suggested. "That would give me time to prepare and, Vaughn prompted when she hesitated. "And perhaps some of the town might come around by then," she finished. Vaughn's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, if you'd prefer to marry elsewhere where your past isn't known—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "Julesburg is my home. I won't be driven from it, and I won't begin our marriage by running away." She squeezed his hands. "Besides, I have a feeling Mrs. Sherman would be quite displeased if we deprived her of a wedding to attend." Vaughn laughed. "You're right about that. And with her support, I suspect more of the town will come around than you might expect." They returned to the social hand in hand, Eleanor's ring catching the lantern light. Mrs. Sherman spotted it immediately, her face breaking into a satisfied smile as she hurried over to congratulate them. Word spread quickly, and to Eleanor's surprise, many of the ranch hands and their wives offered sincere good wishes. As they danced one final time before departing, Eleanor felt a lightness in her heart she had thought forever lost. The journey ahead would not be without challenges. Some in town would never fully accept her, but with Vaughn beside her, she finally believed she had the strength to face whatever came. The month before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and unexpected developments. True to Vaughn's prediction, Mrs. Sherman's enthusiastic endorsement of their engagement shifted some opinions in town. While not everyone embraced Eleanor with open arms, the outright hostility diminished significantly. Sarah Wilson not only renewed her offer for Eleanor to teach at the school, but also volunteered to help with wedding preparations. Ollie Peterson, still running the mercantile in his uncle's absence, extended credit to Eleanor for fabric to make her wedding dress and offered a generous wedding gift, a new cookstove for their future home. Even Pastor Miller, after a long conversation with Vaughn, agreed to perform the ceremony, though his manner remained somewhat reserved one afternoon. As Eleanor was fitting the bodice of her wedding dress with Sarah's help, a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Crawford standing on her porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Fairfield," the woman said stiffly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Stunned, Eleanor nodded and stepped aside to let her enter. Sarah, sensing the delicacy of the situation, excused herself to put on tea. "I won't take much of your time," Mrs. Crawford said, declining to sit. "I've come about your wedding." Eleanor braced herself for disapproval or worse, but Mrs. Crawford surprised her. "My husband and I have discussed the matter, and we believe it would be appropriate for us to attend." The admission seemed to cost her considerable effort. "Mr. Thornton is well respected at the Sherman Ranch, and Mr. Crawford does significant business with them." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was an olive branch of sorts, one extended more for social convenience than genuine remorse. Still, Eleanor recognized it for the significant gesture it was. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," she replied evenly. "You would be welcome." The older woman nodded, then hesitated. "There is one other matter. My niece is to be married next spring, and I understand you have considerable skill with a needle." By the time Mrs. Crawford left, Eleanor had agreed to sew a wedding dress for her niece, a commission that would provide much-needed income and, more importantly, represent a step toward reclaiming her place in the community. "Well," Sarah said, returning with tea after Mrs. Crawford's departure, "miracles do happen." Eleanor laughed, a sound that came more easily to her these days. "I wouldn't go that far, but it's progress." "All because a cowboy took your hand and walked you into church," Sarah observed with a smile. "Sometimes the smallest gestures have the greatest impact." The day before the wedding, as Eleanor was putting the final touches on her dress, another unexpected visitor arrived, Sheriff Davies. His expression was serious as he requested a private word. "Miss Fairfield," he began once they were seated on her porch, "I've received some information I thought you should know before your wedding tomorrow." Eleanor tensed, fear clutching at her heart. "What is it, Sheriff?" "James Blackwell is dead," he said bluntly. "Shot in a gambling dispute in Denver last week. Before he died, he apparently made a confession to a minister who was called to his bedside." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Eleanor absorbed this news. "A confession?" The sheriff nodded, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "The minister contacted the Denver authorities, who in turn contacted me. Blackwell admitted to lying about what happened that night at your father's store. He confirmed your account of events entirely." Eleanor's hands began to tremble. After all this time, vindication had come too late to spare her months of shame and isolation, but not too late to clear her name. "I'll be making a public statement at church on Sunday," Sheriff Davies continued. "I believe I owe you that much, at least." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I should have investigated more thoroughly at the time." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly, "you should have." After the sheriff left, Eleanor sat alone for a long time, processing this unexpected turn of events. When Vaughn arrived for his customary evening visit, he found her still on the porch, staring at the sunset. "Eleanor," he asked, concern in his voice as he took in her expression. "What's happened?" She told him everything, watching as a range of emotions crossed his face: anger at the injustice she had suffered, satisfaction at Blackwell's confession, and finally, a deep tenderness as he took her hands in his. "How do you feel about this?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. Relieved, certainly, but also angry that it took his death for the truth to be acknowledged, and sad in a way for all the months lost to his lie. Those months weren't entirely lost, Vaughn pointed out gently. They led you to me. Eleanor smiled at that. Yes, they did. And for that, I can't bring myself to regret them entirely. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, hand in hand, contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment on the eve of their wedding, with Eleanor's name finally cleared. Tomorrow, Vaughn said softly, when you walk into that church, you'll do so with your head held high, not just as my bride, but as a woman vindicated. No, Eleanor corrected him, squeezing his hand. I'll walk in as I did that first Sunday with you beside me. That means more than any public vindication ever could. Their wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late August morning. The church was fuller than Eleanor had dared to hope, with the Sherman Ranch contingent occupying several pews, and a surprising number of townsfolk in attendance, some out of genuine goodwill. Others perhaps drawn by curiosity about Sheriff Davies' announcement of important information to follow the ceremony. Eleanor prepared in a small side room of the church, Sarah helping her with the final arrangements of her dress and hair. The gown was simple but elegant ivory cotton with lace trim she had salvaged from her mother's wedding dress, restyled into a creation that drew admiring comments from everyone who saw it. You look beautiful, Sarah told her, adjusting the small wreath of wildflowers that served as Eleanor's veil. Truly radiant. I feel it, Eleanor admitted. For so long I thought happiness was something meant for others, not for me, and now, a knock at the door interrupted her. Mrs. Sherman entered, her usual practical demeanor softened by the occasion. My dear, she said warmly, it's time. Are you ready? Eleanor took a deep breath. Yes, I believe I am. As she stepped into the church vestibule, Eleanor was struck by a powerful memory that first Sunday months ago when she had stood frozen outside, too ashamed to enter alone. How different things were now. The music began Mrs. Peterson at the organ, playing a hymn Eleanor had always loved. The doors opened, and she saw Vaughn waiting at the altar, tall and handsome in his new suit, his eyes finding hers immediately. With Mrs. Sherman on one side and Sarah on the other, Eleanor began her walk down the aisle. The faces that turned to watch her were a mixture of friendly, curious, and a few still wary, but none of that mattered now. Her focus remained fixed on Vaughn, whose smile grew wider with each step she took toward him. When she reached the altar, Mrs. Sherman placed Eleanor's hand in Vaughn's, a symbolic gesture that echoed their very first meeting. The older woman leaned in to whisper, "He's a good man. Be happy, both of you." Pastor Miller conducted the ceremony with proper solemnity, though Eleanor detected a new respect in his manner as he addressed her. When the time came to exchange vows, Vaughn's voice rang clear and confident through the church. I, Vaughn Thornton, take thee, Eleanor Fairfield, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death parts us. What God has brought together, let no man put asunder. Eleanor's own voice trembled slightly with emotion as she repeated the sacred words, placing her trust and her future in this man who had seen her worth when others could not. By the power vested in me, Pastor Miller concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Vaughn's kiss was gentle but affirming, a promise of all they would build together. As they turned to face the congregation, now as Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, the applause was genuine and warm. Before they could process out, Sheriff Davies stepped forward, requesting a moment to address the gathering. With a supportive squeeze of her hand, Vaughn stood beside Eleanor as the sheriff formally cleared her name, detailing Blackwell's deathbed confession, and offering an official apology for the mishandling of the investigation. The reaction among the townspeople was mixed shock, disbelief, and for many, shame at their rush to judgment. Mrs. Crawford looked particularly stricken, while others whispered amongst themselves, processing this revelation. When the sheriff finished, an unexpected voice spoke up from the congregation. Mr. Peterson, who had returned from his business travels just in time for the wedding, stood slowly. Miss Fairfield, Mrs. Thornton, now, I believe I speak for many when I say we owe you an apology. We failed as neighbors and as Christians." He looked around the church, his gaze challenging. "Perhaps today can mark a new beginning, not just for this couple, but for Julesburg as a community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the church. As Vaughn led Eleanor back down the aisle, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for so long it had become part of her. The reception was held at the Sherman Ranch, where tables had been set up beneath the cottonwood trees and decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. Many from the church service made their way there, some approaching Eleanor with awkward but sincere apologies, others simply offering congratulations as if the past had never happened. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Thornton?" Vaughn asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Overwhelmed," Eleanor admitted, "but in the best possible way. It's strange I'd almost grown accustomed to being an outcast, and now you've been vindicated and we have our whole lives ahead of us," Vaughn finished, spinning her gently. "Though I must admit, I find I'm eager to have you all to myself." Eleanor blushed at the implication in his words. "We still have guests to attend to, Mr. Thornton." "For now," he agreed with a twinkle in his eye, "but Mrs. Sherman has promised the house is ready for us whenever we wish to." "Retire." The celebration continued into the evening, with food and dancing and more genuine goodwill than Eleanor had experienced in over a year. As the sun began to set, she and Vaughn bid their guests farewell and departed for the foreman's house, which would now be their home. It was everything Vaughn had described: a sturdy two-bedroom structure with a cozy parlor, kitchen, and even a small covered porch. Mrs. Sherman and the ranch wives had prepared it meticulously, with fresh linens on the bed, a pantry stocked with essentials, and vases of wildflowers placed strategically throughout. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," Vaughn said, lifting Eleanor into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "That's not necessary," she protested, though her arms wound naturally around his neck. "Perhaps not," he agreed, setting her gently on her feet once inside. "But I intend to honor every tradition of cherishing you, Eleanor, today and every day hereafter." As night fell fully, they explored their new home together, making plans for curtains here and a chair there, envisioning the life they would build in this place. And when the time came to retire to their bedroom, any nervousness Eleanor might have felt was dispelled by the tenderness in Vaughn's eyes and the gentle reverence of his touch. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought her here from the depths of shame and isolation to this moment of complete belonging. "What are you thinking?" Vaughn murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to be this happy again," she answered honestly. "After everything that happened, I thought that part of my life was over. And now," Eleanor raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes, "now I believe in second chances. In the power of one person to change everything just by offering their hand when it's needed most." Vaughn kissed her softly. "I'm the fortunate one, Eleanor, never doubt that." As they drifted towards sleep, Eleanor thought of that Sunday morning months ago when she had stood outside the church, too ashamed to enter. How could she have known then that the simple act of a stranger taking her hand would lead to this: a home, a husband, a future restored? Life in Julesburg shifted gradually for Eleanor in the months following her wedding and vindication. While some residents remained coolly polite, most embraced the sheriff's announcement as permission to welcome her back into the community. She resumed teaching sewing at the school one afternoon a week, and found herself with a growing business creating clothing for many of the same women who had once shunned her. Vaughn took to his role as foreman with natural authority, earning the respect of the ranch hands and the trust of Mr. Sherman. Their home became a warm gathering place for friends. Sarah Wilson was a frequent visitor, as were several of the ranch families who had supported them from the beginning. When winter arrived, Eleanor faced it without the dread that had plagued her the previous year. Their home was snug, their pantry well stocked, and more importantly, she no longer faced the cold months in isolation. On the contrary, she found herself hosting small gatherings when weather permitted, sharing recipes and stories with other ranch wives while snow blanketed the landscape outside. "You've created quite a home here," Mrs. Sherman remarked one afternoon in January as they sat by the fire quilting together. "Vaughn practically glows with pride whenever he speaks of you." Eleanor smiled, her needle moving in steady rhythm. "He's a good man, better than I deserve." "Nonsense," Mrs. Sherman replied briskly. "You're exactly what he deserves, and he's what you deserve. Sometimes life gets it right, even after getting it terribly wrong first." By spring, Eleanor had news to share with her husband, news she had suspected for weeks, but confirmed with Mrs. Sherman's experienced counsel. She planned a special supper, preparing all of Vaughn's favorites and setting the table with their best dishes and the wildflowers he had brought her the day before. When he returned from work, dusty and tired but smiling at the sight of her, Eleanor felt her heart swell with love all over again. "What's the occasion?" he asked, noticing the special preparations after washing up. "Do I need an occasion to cook a nice meal for my husband?" She countered, though her eyes sparkled with her secret. They ate together, sharing the day's events, Vaughn's progress with the new horses, Eleanor's commission to make a wedding dress for the banker's daughter, the same banker who had refused to speak to her a year ago. When the meal was finished, Eleanor took a deep breath and reached for his hand across the table. "Vaughn, there's something I need to tell you." His expression turned serious. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," she assured him, her smile breaking through. "But our lives are about to change. I'm going to have a baby. Come autumn, there will be 3 of us in this house." Vaughn's face transformed, joy spreading across his features like sunrise. "A baby, you're certain?" Eleanor nodded. "Mrs. Sherman confirmed my suspicions. She says late September or early October from her calculations." In an instant, Vaughn was around the table, gathering her into his arms with a whoop of delight that made her laugh. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her gently before setting her down with sudden concern. "Should I be doing that? I don't want to harm you or the baby." "I'm with child not made of glass," Eleanor assured him, though his concern warmed her heart, "but perhaps save the more enthusiastic celebrations for later in the pregnancy." That night, as they lay in bed discussing names and plans for converting the small second bedroom into a nursery, Eleanor felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. "What is it?" Vaughn asked, noticing her momentary silence. "Just thinking how different this is from where I was a year ago," she admitted. "Sometimes happiness feels precarious, as if it might be snatched away." Vaughn gathered her closer. "That's natural, I think, after what you've been through, but Eleanor, what we've built together is strong. Whatever comes, we'll face it side by side." The months of her pregnancy passed with a mixture of anticipation and occasional anxiety. The town's reaction to the news was heartening. Gifts appeared from unexpected quarters, including a handmade blanket from Mrs. Crawford herself, delivered with a stiff but sincere wish for the child's health. Eleanor's body changed, her dresses requiring adjustment, her movements becoming more careful as summer yielded to early autumn. Vaughn was attentive to the point of hovering sometimes, which both amused and touched her. He spent evenings crafting a cradle from pine wood, his large hands surprisingly deft at the delicate work. On a crisp late September morning, earlier than Mrs. Sherman had predicted, Eleanor's labor began. Vaughn rode for the midwife and Mrs. Sherman in a panic, returning to find his wife calmly preparing the bedroom for what was to come. "You should be resting," he protested, trying to take the sheets from her hands. "This isn't my first time attending a birth, Vaughn," she reminded him. "I helped deliver half the babies in Julesburg before. Well, before, I know what needs doing." Nevertheless, when the midwife arrived, she shooed Vaughn from the room with instructions to boil water and then make himself scarce. Mrs. Sherman, arriving shortly after, took charge of the practical arrangements while the midwife attended to Eleanor. The labor was long but uncomplicated. As evening approached, Eleanor's exhaustion was reaching its peak when the midwife announced she could see the baby's head. "One more good push, Mrs. Thornton," the woman encouraged. "Your little one is almost here." With a final surge of effort, Eleanor felt the baby slip from her body, followed immediately by a strong, indignant cry that brought tears to her eyes. "You have a son," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest after a quick examination. "A fine, healthy boy." Mrs. Sherman opened the door to share the news with Vaughn, who had been pacing the porch for hours. His face, when he entered the room and saw his wife and newborn son, was a study in wonder and love so profound it defied description. "He's perfect," Vaughn whispered, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed, "just like his mother. Would you like to hold your son?" Eleanor asked, her voice tired but happy with reverent care. Vaughn took the swaddled infant in his large hands, cradling him against his chest. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your pa." The baby's cries quieted as he gazed up at his father with unfocused eyes. A tiny hand escaped the blanket, and Vaughn offered his finger, which the infant grasped with surprising strength. "He's already got a good grip," Vaughn observed with pride. "He'll make a fine horseman someday." "Let's get him walking first," Eleanor laughed softly, after the midwife and Mrs. Sherman departed, promising to return in the morning. The new family shared their first moments of privacy together. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had waited to make a final decision until they met their child. "Thomas," Eleanor said, watching her husband with their son. "Thomas Vaughn Thornton, after your father and you." Vaughn looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're sure we could name him after your father instead?" Eleanor shook her head. "My father would understand. This feels right." "Thomas," Vaughn repeated, testing the name as he gazed down at their son. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Thornton. You're a lucky boy, you know. You have the bravest, strongest mother a child could ask for, and the kindest father," Eleanor added. As night settled over their home, Eleanor watched her husband and son together, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of shame and isolation to this moment of perfect joy, all because a stranger had taken her hand when she needed it most. The years that followed brought changes, both expected and surprising. Thomas grew from a robust infant into an active toddler with his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Eleanor's sewing business flourished, eventually expanding into a small shop in town when the former milliner retired and offered her the space at a reasonable rent. Vaughn continued as foreman at the Sherman Ranch, earning a reputation throughout the region for his fair management and skill with horses. When old Mr. Sherman decided to scale back his involvement in the ranch's daily operations, he offered Vaughn a partnership, an extraordinary opportunity that reflected the older man's trust and respect. Their family grew again with the arrival of a daughter, Emily Martha Thornton, named for Vaughn's sister and Mrs. Sherman, who had become like a mother to Eleanor. Emily was born in the spring of 1880, a solemn child with thoughtful eyes who watched the world carefully before deciding to participate in it. The Thornton home became known in Julesburg as a place of warmth and welcome. Sunday dinners often included Sarah Wilson, now Sarah Mitchell, after her marriage to the town's new doctor, various ranch families, and occasionally even Pastor Miller, whose initial reservations about Eleanor had gradually transformed into genuine respect. Mrs. Crawford never became a close friend, but a cordial relationship developed, particularly after Eleanor's skillful creation of her niece's wedding dress led to commissions from several prominent Denver families. The banker's wife found it socially advantageous to claim acquaintance with the talented Mrs. Thornton, whose work is sought after even in Denver society. On a golden autumn day in 1882, almost 6 years after Vaughn had first taken Eleanor's hand outside the church, they attended a special service together. This time, Eleanor walked confidently through the doors, 4-year-old Thomas holding her hand while Vaughn carried 2-year-old Emily. The occasion was the dedication of a new church bell, donated jointly by several families including the Thorntons, to replace the old cracked one that had called the faithful to worship for decades. As they took their customary seats, Eleanor noticed a young woman standing hesitantly at the back of the church, her worn dress and anxious expression painfully familiar. The congregation was filling rapidly, but no one approached the newcomer or offered her a place. "Vaughn," Eleanor whispered, nodding toward the woman. "Would you mind the children for a moment?" Understanding immediately, Vaughn nodded, settling Emily more comfortably on his lap while keeping a watchful eye on Thomas. Eleanor made her way to the back of the church, approaching the young woman with a gentle smile. "Good morning," she greeted her. "I'm Eleanor Thornton. Would you care to join my family for the service?" Relief and gratitude flooded the woman's face. "I'm not sure I should be here," she admitted softly. "People in town have been talking, and I thought perhaps—" "Everyone deserves to hear the Lord's word," Eleanor said, the familiar phrase bringing a rush of memories. She offered her hand. "Would you allow me to walk you in?" The woman hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in Eleanor's. "Thank you, I'm Mary Collins." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mary," Eleanor replied warmly. "And after the service, if you'd like, you're welcome to join us for Sunday dinner. My husband makes an excellent apple pie." As they walked together down the aisle to where Vaughn sat with the children, Eleanor caught his eye. His smile, proud, loving, understanding, was all the confirmation she needed that the circle was complete. The hand once extended to her in kindness was now hers to extend to others. In that moment, surrounded by her family in a community that had learned to embrace second chances, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that her journey from shame to redemption had taught her life's most valuable lesson. A single act of compassion could change everything, not just for the recipient, but for generations to come. Thomas and Emily would grow up knowing this truth, witnessing it in their parents' lives and actions. And someday, when they were old enough to understand, Eleanor would tell them the story of a Sunday morning long ago when a cowboy took her hand and walked her into church, showing her the way back to herself and forward to a life more beautiful than she could have imagined.